This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Even if you and your partner are healthy, there's still a chance your child can develop a serious genetic disease. This is because every embryo has new changes not present in either parent. Most of the time, these are benign, but sometimes they can be catastrophic. Orchid's whole genome embryo reports directly screen the embryo and analyze these de novo genetic mutations. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert. Hey everybody, it's Razib with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast, and today I'm going to be recording a podcast with someone who is something of a savant about gender ideology and all the controversial trans stuff that's in the news. My friend Christina Buttons, who also has Substack, Buttons Lives, and is a freelance journalist and has worked at various outfits. And so I'm not exaggerating. Christina's head is packed full with a lot of information. Some of it, which I've told her, I would rather not know. So she does not look away from painful facts or painful surgeries. It's really what I'm talking about. If you follow her on social media, just expect that she's gonna give you the unvarnished truth of what's happening and not gonna censor too much. And you don't want to look at that timeline sometimes. But it's an important topic, it's an important question, and obviously it's not something. I've talked about this with our mutual friend Colin Wright, who Christina knows very well. But Christina has a somewhat different angle on it, I feel, although she might disagree with me. I feel like she's really focused on details of specific issues. Colin as an evolutionary biologist, has to deal with some of the philosophical issues about what gender ideology is and the sex binary and all that. I'm sure there are alignment on that, but she knows a lot of specific things that are happening in policy, in government, in bureaucracies. And so I want to start there. I want to know what the cast review is. I see it in the news. I read a paragraph here, a paragraph there. There's something called WPATH, acronyms. It's all like a big alphabet soup to me. So Christina, kind of unpack it for us.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me, Razib. So in April, we saw the release of a 4-year investigation into the UK's National Health Service's gender identity clinic for youth. That's their publicly funded clinic. The CAS review and the associated systematic evidence reviews, they basically represent the most thorough appraisal of pediatric gender medicine to date. And across every intervention, they found remarkably weak evidence for gender transitions in minors.
So a cast review is so this is in Britain. Europe is a little ahead in certain things. And in terms of gender transitions, I think what you're getting at here is there was the quote or the saying, do you want a for example, do you want a living daughter or a dead son, these suicides, and so gender transition is basically a way to alleviate dysmorphia, right? And obviously that is supposed to help with mental health. And so you have these youth often who are undergoing legitimate mental distress, and gender transition is a way to alleviate that, right? That's the theory.
Right. So in Britain, because the Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS, was a sort of publicly funded institution, we did have access to some data there. It was, in 2008 or something like that, there were about like 70 patients. These are adolescents seeking gender clinic services. And, by the end of the CAS review, it was something like 8 or 9,000. So it represents a significant increase in adolescents seeking those services, which has caused, alarm for a lot of people, which is one of the reasons why this evidence review was conducted in the first place. And they found that, for many of these youth, they're experiencing a transient phase, is what they referred to it as. And that they indicated that, psychotherapy is the best intervention for them, not medical interventions. So we're seeing a lot of countries in the UK who are rolling back and heavily restricting access to medical interventions. So they're prioritizing therapy instead. But that's not happening in the United States. The US medical organizations, they've all sort of doubled down on their position that, gender affirming care is evidence-based and necessary and life-saving, but none of these things are true. They're not abiding by the principles of evidence-based medicine, systematic evidence reviews, which represent, the pinnacle of evidence-based medicine. They've all found that there is no good evidence to support medically transitioning minors. So
Yeah. And so, obviously therapy, we know what that is. You talk to someone, there's discussions back and forth. Medical transition. Tell us. This is stuff. I'm not gonna lie, listener. Like, this is stuff I avoid digging deep into or thinking about. But for this podcast, I will. I'll go there because sometimes you need to know what the terms actually mean. So medical transition is very clinical, and it detaches you from what's going on. So what is medical transition? I'm assuming hormones, maybe surgeries.
Yeah, for small children, the beginning of transition is a social transition. It includes, changing your name and pronouns and your outer appearance. And then this sort of preps them for the first stages of puberty, Tanner stage 2, which can be different for different kids. It could be 8, 9, 10, 11. This is when they administer puberty blockers, which have long been said to be reversible, but there's new evidence finding that that's not true at all. They say that's just a pause button on puberty, but like almost 98% of the time they go on to cross-sex hormones. And if you go from, puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones, and if you started puberty blockers at Tanner stage 2, it will like guarantee sterility. And cross-sex hormones have a lot of other medical, consequences associated with them.
All right, really quickly. So cross-sex hormones. So that would mean born male, biological male. Puberty blocker obviously stops the masculinization of the face, facial hair, whatever. Okay, I get that. And the cross-sex hormone is then you put them on estrogen to feminize them. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. And then for adolescent girls, they're put on testosterone.
Yeah.
And then
So I'm gonna interrupt. I'm sorry. I have a question here. I don't dig deep into this stuff. Let's set aside. Like, we could talk about the surgeries. Okay, we can talk about that. But when it comes to the hormones, as you know, I have a background as a biologist. I'm not a very mechanistic oriented person with physiology and all this stuff, development, but it never really honestly struck me as intuitively plausible that you could stop a important developmental function like puberty, do cross-sex hormones, which are massively transformative, and then somehow reverse it. Like, can you explain to me how that was plausible as something you would claim? Because it seems like you would assume that it's not reversible.
Well, puberty blockers have been used in children who have started like puberty extremely early, way too early, like 6 or 7 or 8
Yeah,
years old.
that's a condition. There are conditions that do that.
Exactly. And so puberty blockers have been, found to be generally safe to use in this population because they're only sort of delaying puberty for a few years. They're not stopping it at this like critical time during growth and development. So studies that have found that it's safe to use puberty blockers for precocious puberty, sure, but there have been no studies that have found that have been completely safe to use in youth who are experiencing gender dysphoria, and no long-term data exists to support their use in that context. So that is where the belief that they were reversible came from, but really it's out of context.
Yeah, so just like reiterate, like kind of make explicit what's going on here. So, precocious puberty is a thing. Often these kids, this isn't just like a little early or a little late. Like we're talking, as you said, early elementary. Often they grow really fast. Like I've read some articles about males who've undergone this. They get really tall, they get a little facial hair, but their actual final height is actually quite short. You really should not be going into puberty when you're 6 years old. And so there's a legit medical reason to delay it until you're more biologically, I don't know, equipped, I don't know what term would use, to actually start going through all the bodily changes of puberty around, 10 to 14. Let's put it that way, just to give a big range here. Okay. So obviously that's in this like very specific medical context relating to I'm going to call it dysfunction or disorder of puberty. And then with the puberty blocking in this context of gender transition, what you're talking about is taking a child who is undergoing normal physiological and developmental path, but is at least they're reporting psychological distress, actually disrupting the normal path of development. And to me, again, that seems a little ridiculous that you would think, oh, well, it's just like with precocious, precocious puberty. It's just like, this isn't like a Lego block system where you just like put it together and you can disassemble and reassemble, but that's just my impression.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. I reported on a study earlier this year that found a Mayo Clinic study that found severe atrophy in the testes of boys on puberty blockers, and this wasn't really known before. But it also causes, decreases in bone mass and sometimes cognitive delays, sometimes psychiatric issues. There's just a lot we don't know because we don't have any like robust data on this.
And so in a way, there's almost an ethical conundrum where, people don't want to do a randomized field test where, you just assign some boys to the blockers or some boys not, and track them because let's say you have like a huge data set of boys that, boys or girls that underwent puberty blockers, and it turns out that it's a massive problem the rest of their life. Well, what have you just done, right? So we're kind of stuck in I don't want to say no man's land or just like, but it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. But it does feel like that with some of this stuff because it's kind of like you're experimenting on humans, right?
Yeah. And speaking of ethics, that has sort of been the justification all along from activists and from the scientific and medical organizations sympathetic to the activist narratives, is that, if we deprive these children of these medical interventions, they're going to kill themselves because this group of kids has, high rates of suicidal thoughts. But when these are kids who have psychiatric issues anyway. There's no good evidence to support that, not giving them medical interventions is going to cause them to kill themselves. It's just been this myth that has been very pervasive. There is like,
well, I mean, it's become a meme. Like I've heard people say, like use like direct quote, about the suicide issue, right?
Yeah, that's where the would you rather have a live transgender child or a dead child has come from. And I found in my own survey of detransitioners that about 50% said that they heard that exact line, or their family did. So it is very common.
But this is a very recent phenomenon, correct? Like, I mean, I don't think there was a thing like 10 or 15 years ago. Like, where did all this come from? And, yeah, I'm a little curious about that.
Well, after gay marriage was sort of legally recognized nationwide in 2015, a lot of these activist organizations like GLAAD and the Human Rights Campaign, I mean, they kind of needed to shift focus in order to keep their doors open and retain funding. So they kind of pivoted to trans rights. I think Biden, when he was a vice president at one point, said that, trans rights were the new civil rights cause. And that's kind of where a lot of this has all been coming from. Is there's these organizations, like, you can't understate their influence. Human Rights Campaign generates like $50 million a year. And a lot of this has gone into basically propaganda, like activist propaganda. Like, that's where all these mantras come from, like trans women are women and trans rights are human rights. That's where all of this information is coming from, is these activist organizations. And that's been what's been leading pediatric gender medicine, is activism, not science. And we know that, I mean, we have WPATH now. New internal communications from WPATH have just been.
Can you tell us what WPATH is, Christina?
Yeah. So WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. They are a non-profit organization of self-identified experts in transgender healthcare, and they are endorsed by numerous medical organizations, and their influential, like, standards of care guidelines have been adopted by pediatric gender clinics in the US and internationally. Like, I did a review once of all of the pediatric gender clinic websites in 2022, and the vast majority cited WPATH standards of care as, the gold standard. Like, they rely on these standards. So, like, they're incredibly influential. And for a lot of us who have been reporting on this issue have known for a long time that they are, essentially just an activist organization who are kind of looked to as a scientific authority. And these new internal communications that were subpoenaed from WPATH in an Alabama court case on, placing age restrictions on gender affirming care for minors, they were recently released in the past week. And they're incredibly damning. They show that WPATH tried to cover up evidence, that there was no good evidence to support medically transitioning minors. And, they've implicated Rachel Levine, who that is.
Dr. Rachel? It's Dr. Rachel Levine.
Dr. Rachel Levine, the Assistant Secretary of Health for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, who was appointed by the Biden administration, who successfully pressured WPATH to remove age limitations for minors to receive hormonal and surgical sex trait modifications in their latest edition of the Standards of Care 8. These are their guidelines that include chapters on medically transitioning minors. It was released in 2022. So we have emails from around that period now, showing Levine's actions were explicitly politically motivated, driven by concerns that age limitations on these interventions would lead to devastating legislation for trans care. So, and following the news of Levine's involvement, the Biden administration just this past week announced that they oppose gender-affirming surgery for minors, which is very significant because, all of their previous statements, they have supported medical interventions for minors. But, one of the most damning statements, I think, was from a summary judgment from the Alabama Attorney General, who revealed that WPATH authors of the standards of care had said that their priorities lie in affecting policy and winning lawsuits. And I think this is just incredibly damning. It shows that they're prioritizing activism over children's best interests.
Well, so I have a question. You said surgeries. So tell us what you mean by that. Because,
oh, right, the surgeries. For girls, this includes a double mastectomy to remove the breasts. For boys, a breast augmentation. It can also be facial surgeries, genital surgeries, and hysterectomies. For boys, this would include like a penile inversion, vaginoplasty. Do you want further explanation on what that is?
sorry, guys. I made a face. But no, I do want explanation because, like, I always avoid. I think a lot of us we avoid knowing what this means, but we should probably at least know it at least once. But yeah, go on.
Well, I mean, not to get too graphic, but they, invert the penis and create a cavity that is supposed to resemble female genitalia, and it's associated with the high risk of complications. Same thing for kind of the opposite. The phalloplasty for girls involves taking a portion of skin from either their arm or their thigh or someplace like that, and basically rolling it up into like something that resembles a phallus and rerouting their urethra. It's associated with extremely high rates of complications. They frequently need revision surgeries, and you're left with just, this mass of skin removed from your body. I mean, the pictures are horrific, and I've found that they can be effective in sort of changing people's mind about all of this. I mean, these surgeries aren't offered to minors, but like you often see, like 19-year-old girls getting them paid for through their medical insurance and just suffering horrific complications after that. Like it's
okay. So okay, let me get clear then. Are there ever surgeries for minors? And let's define minors as 18 and under, or no, under 18. So 17 and under.
Most frequently, it's girls getting double mastectomies. There is a JAMA surgery study that found between like 2016 and 2019, there were over 1,000 of these double mastectomy surgeries performed on minors. But this is likely a significant undercount because it was relying on hospital data rather than private surgery centers. So that's just to give you an idea. So there are, thousands of adolescent girls accessing these surgeries. That's the most frequent surgery. Sometimes males get breast augmentations, and for some boys, they are able to get, a vaginoplasty surgery at 17. But this isn't as common.
Sure.
As the others, as the chest surgeries. But vaginoplasty is never offered to anyone under 18, though.
Okay. So, that's good to know. Is it now So I know the data in the U.S. is a little. So I should say Britain has a national health service, so it's like literal socialized medicine. Doctors are employees of the government. It's kind of an integrated system. It's not like just subsidies or something to insurance or providers or single payer. So they have pretty good data, I think, compared to us in the U.S., where we have a decentralized healthcare system. We don't have a centralized healthcare system unless you want to talk about Medicare or something like that. And so, I know data can be a little harder, but is it mostly males or females right now that are making recourse to medical transition?
It's mostly females. The vast majority are young girls. In the past, and I'm talking about like in the past, like since I guess since like the 70s, it was rare, but it was mostly young boys who were seeking gender clinic services, and these were mostly, male children who would later grow up to be gay. So they didn't used to offer medical interventions to them in the past, and there was without those interventions, there was a high rate of desistance in these children who were predominantly male. But the Dutch had decided to take a select group of young kids and introduce puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and surgeries to them. They carefully selected this group, but we and introduced these interventions to them. It became known as the Dutch Protocol, and then around 2008, the Dutch Protocol was sort of adopted in the United States and became the gender affirming model of care that is used here. It's a lot less cautious and careful than the Dutch Protocol.
So gender affirming, tell us what that means. Again, a lot of the listeners, like I will just tell you, I know you are, very well aware of this, but I'll tell you, a lot of older people have no idea what you're talking about half the time. They kind of know the trans stuff, but they don't know. So that's why I'm, what is gender affirming?
Oh, well, gender affirming refers to the gender affirming model of care, and it's kind of a euphemism for pediatric sex trait modification or pediatric sex changes. The affirming part comes from this idea that, this belief that transgender children are born that way and that they need support and medical interventions in order to affirm their gender identity. Gender identity is this said to be this, internal sense of maleness or femaleness, and transgender youth are said to possess a gender identity that is mismatched from their body. The purpose of gender affirming care is to align the body with the gender identity, which is also sometimes referred to as brain sex or neurological sex, which we can get into. This is completely based on this myth that transgender people possess an opposite sex brain. This was very common among the detransitioners I surveyed, who about 50% had said that their doctor had told them they possessed a male brain in a female body or a female brain in a male body. It comes from these studies on the transgender brain that didn't control for confounding variables such as sexual orientation and cross-sex hormone use. There were a number of studies in the 90s that sort of found this area of the brain in gay people that sort of structurally resembled the opposite sex. And then later, when they did these studies on the transgender brain, they didn't control for sexual orientation. So they basically because a lot of transgender people are gay, a lot of them are homosexual, their brains showed up with the region that sort of structurally resembled the opposite sex. And then a lot of researchers published their results saying, look, transgender people are who they say they are. And then the media got a hold of these studies and said, look, science proves trans people aren't making it up. And then these studies got baked into legislation and into medical guidelines. And it's so common, the brain sex myth is so common. It's even in the I Am Jazz children's book about Jazz Jennings, the child who transitioned. It's a very, very popular children's book based on her life and her reality TV series. It's so pervasive, and not really enough has been done to dispel this myth, except for a study that did control for confounding variables and found that trans people have brains of the same sex, not the opposite sex. But of course, nobody has really done enough to, the media, of course, like just completely ignores studies like that. If they don't align with their narrative,
Well, I want to say here, the brains of males and females, when it comes to a single characteristic, there's a lot of overlap. But when you look at all of the different characteristics, they're quite distinct, and you can you can do a brain scan, get the morphology, classify male or female pretty easily, because the cumulative correlation of characteristics allows people to make that distinction. And I'm going to use a quick analogy to make clear what I'm talking about with people. If you have a single trait of somebody, it's hard to classify them racially based on what they're. So I have brown skin. There's a lot of people in the world that have a lot of different populations that have brown skins, right? But if I told you I had brown skin, very straight black hair, no epicanthic fold, I think you would start to figure out probably South Asian. You know what I'm saying? So if you give enough characteristics, you can narrow down population identity. And so with male and female brains, the brains are obviously quite similar insofar as we're obviously both Homo sapiens, and we have white matter, gray matter, the same, or everyone's got a brain stem, everyone's got a cerebellum, but males and females are subtly different across a host of metrics in such a fashion that you can create a very, very good composite index measure of male versus female. And so this is the context that I want to bring up, or I want to say is in the background of this idea. If you are a transgender person, you have a male or female brain, which is in the body of the opposite sex. Obviously, we know what an opposite sexed body is. It has to do with external genitalia and other things like that. Well, what the inference from this idea would be like, you look at the brain morphology, and that's the brain morphology of a female and a male, or vice versa. What you're saying, Christina, is that's not really true, right?
Right.
So, yeah, go on, Christina.
No, there are brain studies on transgender people that are more plausible, that have to do with the own body perception region of the brain. But we don't really. It doesn't show a causal link. It's only an association, and there are a lot of conditions that are associated with abnormalities in body perception networks in the brain. Including body dysmorphic dysphoria and anorexia, the body integrity identity disorder, I think possibly even autism. And there are a lot of autistic people who identify as trans, so that would be interesting to look into further.
So I think we could talk about a couple of different categories here. There are people who I'm just going to say general category because I'm not trying to be pejorative, mental health issues, cluster. So autism, that's a mental health issue, Now I understand that,
it's a neurodevelopment disorder.
Yeah, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, but I mean, it's just
there's mental health issues often associated with it.
Yeah. Like schizophrenia, all of these other issues. I also do know, I'm just going to say this because, a lot of people might not know this, but MTF, there are a fair number of extremely high level software engineers that are MTF. And really, really hardcore engineers, like people that work in Rust or something. There's a lot of them that are MTF, and a lot of them are autistic. They're very left-brained, is the way I'm going to explain it. Hyperlogical. So I don't know all the details, but people have noticed like some patterns. And in terms of like adults, like whether they want to transition or not, that's up to them. I think that's how I feel. But there are a lot of patterns out there, and I think some people are a little scared to maybe write about it or talk about it extensively because like who knows why someone is going to get mad at you about this, right? I don't know.
Well, I have transgender friends. I don't. I mean, if I basically I write about this stuff because I want people to make informed decisions that I want people to make decisions that they're going to be happy with in the long term. I don't think children can give consent. But even, there's a subsection of like vulnerable young adults with autism, psychiatric conditions, typically like 18 to 25, I would say like that's kind of a vulnerable group. I want people to have all of the best, most reliable information in order to make informed decisions that they can be happy with in the long term. I don't necessarily want to stop people from transitioning when they're an adult. That's not ever been my intention. Um,
Yeah. So go on, Christina.
No, what I'm saying though is to like it's research into gender dysphoria is difficult because the transgender population is so heterogeneous. Like there's so many different pathways now to trans identification. Homosexual
Yeah.
pathways that we talked about, and then there's sort of the autogynephilia pathway that is, a lot of heterosexual men.
Define what that is. A lot of people will not know.
Yeah, it's the attraction to oneself as a woman. It's
a sexual fetish. It's a sexual fetish.
a paraphilia, I guess maybe would be the best word for it. But this is, represents a significant number of the adult males who are transitioning into women. And it's, very taboo. Not a lot of people like to talk about it or pretend that isn't real. But I believe it's very real. If you even just take a look at, the transgender Reddit forums about gender euphoria boners. I mean, it sounds funny, but there are a lot of young men out there who are confused and like they're not getting enough information to understand like what it is, what's going on with them. They think they're transgender women. They might be dealing with autogynephilia, and maybe transitioning might not be right for them. But if they don't have access to good information about what their condition is and kind of life they want to lead, it's, I think.
Well, okay, so we've been talking about like kind of in the weeds, which I wanted to actually start out with. Because that's your forte, I feel, about this sort of stuff. But I want to take a step back. We don't need to go into all the details. But like both you and Colin actually. But like let's talk about you mostly here. You're positioned in a very interesting like location. Like not necessarily ideologically, but in terms of I don't know, just the various groups. So a lot of people aren't going to know like TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists. That's one group online. Obviously, there's a trans activists. There's social conservatives. There's liberals that like just kind of go along with it, et cetera, et cetera. You and Colin are both not religious, but you obviously have gotten into it with just called woke quote activists. You yourself were woke, and you've talked about that on other podcasts. We don't need to go into details, but
for about like 8 months, I was.
8 months is a long time. You're not that old. I mean, that's a fair amount of your adult life.
I'm 35.
Yeah, well, that's a fair amount of your adult life. I mean, you can't reverse it. It's irreversible, like the effect on your brain. But
yeah, no, it was a learning experience. I learned my lesson.
But then you worked for the Daily Wire, then you left the Daily Wire. Sometimes I see you and Colin involved in social media issues that I have no idea who these people are, and I have no idea why they're angry. And they could be right wing, left wing, religious, atheist, TERFs, trans. You guys are just involved in the mix. Can you talk just a little bit about that, like how that feels and why you get yourselves in this situation?
I tried not to. I try to spend most of my time writing and doing research and not getting involved on Twitter spats, but I feel like every year and a half I forget that this lesson and I need to relearn it again. Because that was about the length of time that sort of transpired between the most recent one and the last one, where I kind of got into it with some gender critical women or trans-exclusionary radical feminists. Sometimes people think I'm one of them, but I'm not. I'm not a feminist. And I don't really call myself gender critical. Like I'm just a journalist. But no, I dislike the way that some people behave online towards transgender people. I think that we should treat people as individuals and not based on their entire group identity. A lot of the comments I see towards transgender people have been very like degrading and demeaning. And if I ever stand up for them, I usually get backlash from this community of people online, the gender critical community. And so that's been, nothing ever good comes of it. And then it just, causes a lot of my mental health to deteriorate. And so I have to remind myself and just don't engage with them. And just carry on with what I'm doing. But it seems like every year and a half I forget and need to relearn that lesson.
And also, you left a position at the Daily Caller, so or Daily Wire. Yeah.
Yeah, I had when I first started writing about this a couple years ago, like there weren't really any options. Like the liberal media had not touched this issue in a critical way at all. This was before the New York Times kind of bravely set themselves apart from the mainstream media and began doing some really good reporting on it. But I was working in conservative media to begin with, even though I've voted Democrat my whole life, even for Biden. I think this is the first year I'm not going to be voting. I'm a registered independent now, but no, I decided to give conservative media a chance. And then I was kind of bothered by some comments that some of the commentators had made. I decided that I needed to sort of professionally distance myself from them. And so I sort of wrote a public statement. And then I've been kind of independent ever since.
I mean, that seems in keeping with just like what I know about you. You're not a team player. Let's put it that way.
I'm not a team player. Yeah, that sounds right. I've most of my life I work better kind of alone.
Well, I mean, weren't you a cartoonist or artist before?
For a time, yeah. While I was for a couple of years, yeah, I was doing children's books, illustrating them. I'm an artist.
So you have this profile now, I'm not gonna say it's an esoteric topic, although you get pretty deep into it. It is something that's in the public eye. Just out of curiosity, like, did you lose a lot of friends over this? I mean, what's your social circle like? I mean, I know a little bit. Like, I have visited you and Colin actually in Nashville. I should just tell the people that, like, we're friends. But yeah.
Well, you're my part of my social circle. Most of my
Yeah.
most of the friends I have are online, and I see them at conferences. Don't have a very robust social life in real life.
Well, I mean, you guys just moved to Nashville last couple of years, so you got some time, you know.
It's been a few years. I think we should have made more friends in that time. I have a couple friends here that I see occasionally, but I've been, I mostly keep to myself and work constantly, and have just been sort of focused on career right now. Um, my cats are my best friends, I guess.
All right, you're fulfilling some stereotypes, you know. No, but so let me ask you. You have like given like several years of your life now, to these gender related questions that have fixated our country in a way. I think like last 5 years, I would say last 5 years, not 10. That's a little too much, but last 5 years, it's been a big deal. And trans rights, trans identity has actually been, as you said, Biden has President Biden has foregrounded this sort of stuff, and it's like it doesn't matter how many trans people you think exist in this country; they're just a big deal in our culture. But all of these sorts of things tend to fade. If I had to bet, when I was growing up, I'm a little older than you, there were trans people. They're a pretty taboo thing, but there were people who were like really into transitioning, and those are people where it's like, okay, yeah, maybe you should let them do it, whatever. Like that was something they really wanted to do. Now, today, there's a lot of non-binary, kids. Some of my daughter's friends, she's 12. Some of them are non-binary. They change their name, but they don't do anything medical, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge proportion of some schools. That's probably going to fade culturally. I don't think that it's going to last indefinitely. So, what do you have an idea of like what you want to do, like what your beat is, like as a freelance journalist, as a journalist, as an investigator, once this topic is not so red hot?
Well, I'm been working on something for the last 3 or 4 weeks, that I foresee is, well, it's an issue that's important to me, but we'll see how how much people actually care about it when I publish some articles about it. And that has to do with like the youth mental health crisis, and this sort of, what I see as like an essential resource that is just drastically declined in the last I mean since around 2010. I think like these youth residential treatment centers have uh declined since about like 60% since 2010. And it's created this sort of bed shortage crisis for youth with severe emotional and behavioral needs, who are often placed now in like overcrowded inpatient hospitals and boarded in emergency rooms. Then this affects foster youth too, who have sort of severe needs, behavioral issues. I think in at least like 18 states, foster youth are being sort of boarded in inappropriate settings like office spaces, conference rooms, and hotels and things like that. So, what we're seeing is the decrease in residential treatment settings for youth. It's not due to like a lack of effectiveness or a lack of need, but this like growing ideological opposition to them that have resulted in policies that have like significantly restricted their access. And it comes from this belief that youth residential treatment, or the troubled teen industry, as many like to call it, it comes from this idea that there's widespread abuse going on in them, but there isn't really any data to support that. there've been this industry has been around, I think, like 100 years or something. They're treatment settings that are sort of in between like an inpatient hospitalization and an outpatient treatment. They sort of represent this intermediate step in this like continuum of care, and they're like settings that house youth, that offer 24-hour staff and therapeutic services, and it allows children who have like severe needs to kind of stabilize and learn coping skills, so that they can eventually return home and into the community. But there's obviously like wide variability between all these different treatment centers. Like with most treatment options, there's like significant diversity in the quality and the type of services offered.
But Christina, treatment for what? Like, what sort of mental health issues do youth have? I'm wondering. I know about like juvie for like kids that are disruptive, obviously, or whatever. But obviously, these are not that. Is it depression? Is it bipolar? Is it all sorts of things? I don't know.
It has to do with the behaviors. So like, a bipolar person, they can live at home as long as they're being safe and not engaging in self-harm and suicide attempts and things like that. That's more what I'm referring to. So the severe emotional and behavioral issues, it's, someone who presents a threat to themselves or others who can't live at home safely. These treatment centers are usually a last resort for when all other options have been exhausted, and this is just important to me because this was, my teenage experience. I had depression, and I was self-harming. I was anorexic. I was doing drugs. I had all kinds of risky behaviors. And then, I attempted suicide. And over like
Whoa.
over a 9-month
Okay,
period.
this just got dark. I didn't know that about you.
Yeah. Well, people are going to learn a lot more about me when I start publishing about this. But this was my teen experience. I was in a dozen different placements over a 9-month period. And then my final placement was like a lockdown residential treatment facility in Utah. It's the same one Paris Hilton's trying to shut down, Provo Canyon School.
Yeah, yeah.
She's been in the media.
So she's on the other. She's on the other side. She's on the other side from you.
She's trying to shut them down and restrict access to them. That's her goal, and she's been. She testified in front of Congress last week about the alleged abuse that she experienced there in the 90s. And this has, been her crusade in the last few years. Like, she's returned to the spotlight to reform the troubled teen industry.
So are these? So I don't know anything about this. Are these private facilities that are paid for by parents, or are these government, or are they mixed? I don't know.
They're a mix of private and non-private entities. And like I said, there's wide variability between them. And some of these under-resourced facilities who lack staff, like sometimes bad things occur in them, and it's horrible. And, abuse should always be addressed and, dealt with appropriately. But like these treatment centers, like it was extremely beneficial to me, and I didn't enjoy being there at all. I mean, I think that's what I'm seeing now from a lot of the activists who want to shut these places down, this like activist movement that's kind of been spearheaded by Paris Hilton. They're just sort of reframing things as abuse that should never be characterized as abuse. They believe that seclusion and restraint, these are interventions used on violent youth or for youth who are self-harming, in order to keep them safe and keep everybody else safe, they're heavily regulated by state and federal authorities. But I'm constantly seeing them now being reframed by activists as abuse. I just don't think that's accurate or helpful at all. I never had seclusion or restraint used on me because I never acted out. And I only ever saw them being used judiciously on youth who were becoming violent. I saw no abuse of any kind at this treatment center that I went to. I think that with everything going on with the youth mental health crisis, I think that we should be utilizing high quality treatment centers more and not less. And this is, I think, especially true for if there's a lot of recent studies out that show that there are youth being readmitted to psychiatric inpatient hospitals and repeated visits to the emergency room for attempted suicide and self-harm, repeated usage of mobile crisis centers, crisis services. And these, I think, are youth who would probably benefit from the structured and therapeutic environment that a youth residential treatment center can provide, so they can develop self-control and healthier coping skills so that they can be safely reintegrated into the community, because it's just not sustainable to have youth who are just constantly getting sent back to the emergency room over and over for, crisis they're experiencing. And my experience is usually it's just not very common to hear someone talk about this stuff. But like in my experience, like I liked the inpatient psychiatric setting. Like I would do things to get sent there. I would run away from other settings so that I would be placed back in that one. And I had to learn that like how to control myself and stop these behaviors.
Is the title of your piece going to be "Commit Me"? No, I'm just joking.
That's cute.
No, yeah, that's why they pay me the big bucks. So wait, how many people? How many kids? I don't know anything about this. How many kids go through this sort of system? Like, is it like hundreds? Is it thousands? Is it tens of thousands?
I'll give you a good estimate. It was something I've spent weeks researching this. So there's not a lot of good data out there. And one of the purposes of Paris Hilton's federal bill that she's been advocating for, one of the purposes of it is to establish like a national database of all programs so they can keep track of how much abuse there is going on. So until we have a database like this, we don't really have the data necessary to provide insights on the prevalence of abuse or make definitive claims about it being widespread or not. So what I've sort of been looking into and trying to figure out is, how many youth are going through these programs. And they're basically 3 different kinds of groups of kids that they serve. And that is the foster youth in the child welfare system, who usually have severe emotional and behavioral needs, who have exhausted all of the other settings, so they need like a higher level of care. And then there's the cohort that I kind of belong to. These are where I came from, a supportive family, but I wasn't safe living at home and I needed a higher level of care for my behaviors. And then there's the juvenile justice system, the youth offenders. So this has sort of simultaneously been happening where, especially in like California and liberal states, they're trying to reduce the use of juvenile hall and place juvenile offenders into residential treatment settings. So the Government Accountability Office determined, like looking at data around 2004, 2005, they determined there were about like 200,000 youth in residential treatment settings. And relying on similar sources, I was able to determine that in 2020, there are about 83,000. So let's say over the past 30 years or so, millions of kids have gone through programs, and there's so much variability between them. So there's all different kinds. And that's one of the other issues is, residential treatment, it's sort of defined differently by a lot of different people, and different states define it differently. There has been a problem with collecting enough data on this issue from states. But the Health and Human Services data has shown that for the past 20 years, staff at residential treatment facilities and group homes have on average accounted for about 0.2% of perpetrators of abuse and fatalities nationwide. So, and that's been consistent. I looked at every report for over 20 years. So it hasn't been this growing or increasing huge problem. It's just, this is how many people, in any healthcare setting, you're going to have abuse occasionally occur, and it's terrible, and we should always try and do things to prevent it. But it's just kind of a fact of life. Anytime there's going to be children, any setting, basically. But federal data also shows that psychiatric residential treatment facilities are statistically as safe as general hospitals. So, given all of this, I just don't think that we have enough data to support the claims. There widespread abuse occurring with them, and that's why I think until that data proves otherwise, we shouldn't really be divesting from this resource. I think that could be incredibly helpful. I mean, we have youth completed suicides too that have seen a significant rise over the past decade. They're up 50% or something like that. And I think residential treatment could help sort of with that as well.
Wow, this is a whole topic that actually, I mean, I know what you're talking about, but I haven't thought about it deeply. And you're right, it does affect a lot of kids, a lot of teens. It's interesting. I don't know if you listen to the podcast, but I had Rob Henderson on. And, there's this whole there's this whole foster world. That a lot of these kids are involved in. And it's just really weird, listening to his experiences, because it's so detached from anything that I understand.
Oh yeah, the foster stuff is crazy because there's this a lot of these policies affect them. And what's interesting too is there's this whole abolish foster care movement from the anti-racist side, who says that foster care is systemically racist because it disproportionately affects minorities. So they think that because it's racist, it needs to be abolished, and we need to keep children at home. But of course, it would be nice to keep children home, but not if they're in an unsafe home. So there's been this push since in recent years, the Family First Prevention Services Act, that have sort of this ideological view that we need children to stay at home in their communities rather than be placed in group or residential or congregate care settings. And there are some policy experts who are doing really great work on this issue, like Naomi Schaefer Riley, and she just had a great piece in the New York Times about this. But there's been an uptick in child fatalities from children who have been abused or neglected in the home ever since they started cutting back on foster care. And I think that's something we're going to probably be talking about more in the future. I think it's these policies were put in place a few years ago, and I think we're starting to see more data that shows that they weren't really a good idea.
Well, that's bad news, but good news for you. You might have a, I don't want to say it that way, but you know what I'm saying. A utopian world would leave, Buttons lives with, less fodder, right?
What is
It's like
less fodder?
less fodder. It's like, like in the Matrix, the computer, whatever, like the artificial intelligence was basically like, we made this like awesome paradise for humans, but they went crazy and they didn't like it. So we have to make a world that has some dramatic tension, some bad negative stuff, and if it bleeds, it leads. Like that's the news summary, right? So it's just like you need content to feed the machine, and seems like unfortunately this is something that will require some investigation and exploration if it's a new policy that's I mean, we see it with schools. They got rid of discipline because of disparate impact, and I don't want to get into it, but that's a whole thing.
This is very
Yeah.
this is sort of parallel to it. There's all progressives are putting forth all of these policies that don't make any sense, and it just reinforces this idea that I have about progressives, that I just don't think they understand children at all. These are, architects of very bad policies.
Well, no, Christina, you have to listen to the children when they tell you something because they know.
Determined care, where a 2 or 3-year-old can tell you, what gender they are, and we should always listen and affirm them.
So I gotta tell you a story. Maybe I need to think about this, but my 7-year-old, he told me one time, he's like, "Daddy," I think he was like 6 at the time, so he was a little younger. But "Daddy, can I go on a cake diet?" This is what he told me, and I just ignored it. I ignored like his truth because you don't know nothing about nutrition. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't care. You're 6 years old. I'm not gonna have you on a cake diet, but that's what he wants. He told me when he grows up, he's gonna eat just all cake, and I was like, hey, you do you. When you're 18, I got no control over that. You can eat all cake, but yeah, if you have little kids, you know that you don't want to listen to them all the time because they don't know nothing. No offense. All the little kids listening out there.
I mean, are these policymakers, do they not have kids? Do they not understand kids at all? It doesn't make any sense to me. How the Senate Finance Committee, they just released this 2-year investigation into youth residential treatment centers. And they described the kids who are typically served in these facilities as children for whom we have made no place for in the real world. And we need to create and reimagine a real world for these children. And then later on in the report, they say that when these kids escape from the facilities, they are dangerous and present a risk to the community. So it's like, which is it? Do we integrate them into the community, or are they a risk or danger to the community?
I mean, yeah. Well, okay. So I think, as we're closing up, I will say this is what I believe, but it's obvious. There are some social reformers, and let's not even say progressives, just social reformers. They have ideas about specific things, but they don't have a coherent, broader vision of what the society should be like. And so, for example, to give a concrete example, like Freddie DeBoer, the communist hereditarian on Substack, he often points out that very, very far left-wing progressive activists believe in criminal justice reform, and so people should obviously they serve their time, but they get reintegrated to society. At the same time, they also want any man who has committed a sexual offense or sexual harassment to be branded with a scarlet S the rest of their life. These two are contradictory, right? But in the singular moment, that is what they want. They just don't have a bigger vision. Like, how does it all integrate together? And so the two hands don't talk to each other. That's kind of what you're alluding to in the context of children, where I don't think that there's actually a vision of what how children are supposed to have bodily autonomy or autonomy. I mean, they don't actually have autonomy. They just don't legally, So how does this work?
Yeah, exactly. I think we need harsher punishments, not less harsh. That's just me. I mean, I
Okay.
watch true crime. I don't know what's going on, but like, I feel like the last few documentaries I've watched, the sentences were so short for these horrible crimes. I'm like, what are they going to learn from like 10 months in jail? Like, put them in there longer. Doesn't make any
All
sense.
right. It sounds like maybe you have a potential fellowship in criminal justice at the Manhattan Institute in your future.
I don't know. I've always been interested in true crime.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people are. All right. So I guess we've been talking for a while. It's great catching up with you. I will see you and Colin sometime soon, and you guys got to come down to Austin. I got a guest room here for you guys, and Colin's come before, so you need to come this time. And
Back here anytime too.
yeah. No, Nashville's great. I went out there. Just for the listeners know, I went out there in March, and if you're following me on social media, that cowboy hat that I got that in Nashville, downtown Nashville, probably overpriced, but whatever. So yeah, it's very Nashville and Austin are an interesting contrast. There's a lot of similarities, a lot of bachelorettes, but the bachelorettes in Nashville, they more went to Mississippi State. The bachelorettes in Austin, are more flying in from say California or Florida. I'd say definitely like it's somewhat a different scene. And I was surprised how close Nashville is to is it like Alabama and Georgia? It's kind of like south towards there in the central part of the state. So it's very interesting. How these Sunbelt cities are growing. And but anyway, I would love to see you guys soon. It was great catching up with you. Learning. This is like the one time I'm gonna ask questions like this. Like I figure I should just do it once, but I think people do need to know, especially if we're older, just because this is something that's affecting the youth. And I do think we are past the peak of it, but it's still going to be a live issue probably for the coming decade or so as it fades out, right?
Yeah, we're gonna have a lot of detransitioner lawsuits too. And I mean, I think 17 of them have been filed to date, and we haven't really even seen the outcome. Trials take a long time. So
Yeah.
that'll be interesting.
That's a word for it. Interesting. Anyway, it was great catching up with you, Christina. I will see you online. Buttons lives, not Buttons lives. Buttons lives.
I'm
All
here.
right,
Okay. Thanks for having me, Razib.
Even if you and your partner are healthy, there's still a chance your child can develop a serious genetic disease. This is because every embryo has new changes not present in either parent. Most of the time, these are benign, but sometimes they can be catastrophic. Orchid's whole genome embryo reports directly screen the embryo and analyze these de novo genetic mutations. Discuss embryo screening and IVF with a genetics expert.
This podcast for kids